Okay, there we go. Erin, it is wonderful to reconnect. How are you? It has been a couple of weeks. But super pumped for today's convo to talk about fat because we've chatted about protein, we've chatted about carbs, and so the last big macro for us to really talk about is going to be fat and where that fits in and try to round that out with the other conversations that we've had. And so I think maybe the best place to start in the fat story is if we go like way back to I think what was it, the 7 nations or the 7 countries study, because like fat's been through a roller coaster ride of don't eat fat because it's gonna give you like heart disease and make you fat and all this other stuff. And then we've had like the pendulum swing way to the opposite direction of like eat all the fat in the world and eat 0 carbs. And so like there's a little nuance here, right? The answer is somewhere in the middle. So maybe we can give a little bit of a background of kind of like the things that have shaped our perception and knowledge around fat. So we can maybe appreciate how we got to where we are and then talk about more like prescription stuff, like what to actually do.
So fats, really big family of macromolecules. There's a lot going on in there. And just like we said with carbs and protein, they've had a story of really being a hero or a villain on any given decade. But that's because they're a huge family of macromolecules and they come in different degrees of saturation and different lengths. And now we're learning that all those different chemical compositions make them behave differently. So that's why fats don't have a great black and white story, so to speak. It really comes down to the type of fat and how we can use those.
For sure. And can you backtrack maybe and bring people up to speed if they don't know the story of, I think it's the 7 nations or the 7 countries study that person did where they kind of like traveled around the world, and then it turns out that they very much like cherry picked data with regards to saying like this is how everyone needs to eat because these countries have low heart disease, and so this is how we're going to solve this problem. And then he just like totally ignored countries that had higher fat diets. And so like that was kind of like where the fat shaming began, I believe. Was it Keys?
Yeah.
Was Keys the individual's name who did it? Is my brain cells are like searching for that name?
Totally. Ansel Keys. This was one of our first. I always joke with people when we look at nutrition science history. This was one of our first like major drama moments in nutrition science. And we had labs in the 70s, beginning even in the late 50s, but through the 60s and 70s, we had labs start battling about what's causing heart disease. And some labs were looking at sugar, and they were saying it's got to be the sugar. And then other labs were looking at fat, and they were saying, no, it's got to be the fat. And we had this, there's a couple of them who were kind of all involved, but Ansel Keys in particular was a researcher who really, really postured his work as it is definitely fat that is causing plaque and heart attacks and things of that nature. And in hindsight, looking at his work, we now see that it was really cherry picked, which we know is a common problem in research where we kind of just take the data that confirms our bias and ignore all the rest. And he had a pretty big dose of that going on.
Yeah, because I mean, anyone that has a hammer, everything tends to then look like a nail, right? But let's maybe start, I think, with fat. It's helpful for people to appreciate what are some of the benefits and roles fat is playing for us physiologically, right? I mean, I think right out of the gate when we think energy, it's like, okay, we have fats and we have carbs, the 2 primary ways our body relies on getting energy, right? And I always like to break it up as saying, okay, well, carbs are more fast energy. Fats are going to be more slow energy. So from a demand standpoint, like if I go out and, you can think just kind of running if you want to, right? Like if I go out and I want to sprint 800 meters as fast as I can, that is going to be a pretty carb heavy activity because my intensity and output is high. It has to be faster energy. But in my normal day to day, like you and me having a conversation here, going on a walk in the woods, or even doing like really low intensity aerobic exercise, the thing that your body is going to be utilizing, relying on the most is going to be those fat stores, right? And so I didn't know if we could maybe start there to give a little bit of a physiologic picture of, fat, kind of what it's doing for us. It's doing a lot of things, right? There's some, depending on the fat we're talking about, like we're looking at fish oil and maybe some of the anti-inflammatory properties that brings to the table. But if we could do just a quick pass over here of what is fat doing from us, bird's eye view.
Definitely. So I like to think of all our nutrition as underneath all these macronutrients. We always have an energy story. And this is where I think fat also gets a little bit of a misunderstanding sometimes because we know we store fat. So I think it feels really easy for us to think, well, if I eat fat, I store fat. So fat must make me fat. So that kind of can be a little bit of a confusing point, because our bodies store energy. So any energy for later we can store in carbohydrate, in glycogen, in muscle, but we also can store it in fat tissue. And how we store fats, we store them in a form called triglycerides. And fats as a family are this super rich energy source. So I think we got a little bit into this with the carb unit, but our cells, we have these little powerhouses in them that we call mitochondria, and mitochondria can transfer energy into ATP. And I always say transfer because we can't make energy out of nowhere. And I just like to kind of drive that home. We're transferring energy transferring it into a form that our cell can use. So we do really nicely with fat. We can make about 38 ATP molecules for one fat molecule for full oxidation. And the reason that's interesting is because that's a lot, but that has to be done in the presence of oxygen. So fat can only be oxidized in an aerobic setting, as James mentioned. So we do really nicely with a lot of fat and fat usage, and it's moving around in so many different ways. We use it for fuel, but we also use it for building blocks. We use it in cell membranes. We know that brains, a big area of research now is actually in utero, how much fat and different types of fats, omega-3s, omega-6s, omega-9s are being used in utero by the infant as the brain develops and the spinal cord. And so we know fat is really being used in so many different ways, also as cell protection and transport, communication, lipid barriers. We're really using it all over, but it absolutely is this super dense energy source that our cells really like when we have oxygen available.
Mm-hmm. What if we want to categorize these fats? Because I think people probably hear this all the time. They're like, well, there's these monounsaturated and these polyunsaturated, and it's like, I think that can get really confusing for folks. Maybe if we could hit the different categories of fat molecules and just briefly say kind of like an example of each, right? Because then I think just the categorization of those can get really confusing for folks and people. They're like, is this thing good? Is it bad? And we want to think less good and bad and probably just more like quantity of exposure more than anything, right? But maybe if we could just hit a quick overview of like the broad categories of fats and kind of an example, and then maybe like, what is this thing doing for us? What is it bringing to the table?
Definitely. So the first thing with fats, the two biggies that are going to dictate its chemical behavior and composition are going to be its length and then its degree of saturation. So fats are just these really long carbon chains. They can be really, really long, but they also can be medium and they also can be short. So when you hear MCTs, that's medium chain triglyceride. So triglyceride is another term for fat. That's the proper term, really. So that is a medium length chain of fat. So that's just how many carbons long it is. And really long ones can be 18, 32, shorter ones might be 14, short ones might be more like 9. So they really come in these different lengths. And then the really big one is the saturation point. So when those carbons are all bonded fully to hydrogens and one another, they're fully saturated. And they kind of stack like sheets of paper on top of one another. That's why when we see butter, it can sit there in a stick because it literally is fully saturated. So those long chains of the carbon and of the fat essentially aren't interacting with anybody. They're happy. I always think of like in terms of chemical bonding, when a carbon is fully saturated, it doesn't need to talk to anybody else. It just needs to hang out where it's at. It's happy. So that's saturation. So then monounsaturated, therefore, it means that there is one place, mono, in the carbon chain where it's not fully saturated. That's where we see a double bond. So there's one. And then polyunsaturated fats are where multiple carbons have a double bond because they're not fully saturated. And that's why monounsaturated fats like olive oil are liquid at room temperature, because when they're not fully saturated, they get these kind of kinks in the fatty acid chain. So that's why they're liquid. And then similarly with the polyunsaturated fatty acids like a good fish oil or something of that nature, flaxseed oil, they're fully liquid at room temp. So, and then one way I think of the chain length too is coconut oil. This is a kind of a trick question. Coconut oil is actually the most saturated fat. It's about 97% saturated, which is more than beef or animal fat or butter, actually. But it is short in chain. So it's usually about 14 to 18 carbons long. We get some medium to longer chain triglycerides in there, which is why coconut oil, if you scoop it out of the jar in your house, it might be solid. Put it in your palm, and that'll melt in a few seconds because the shorter chain can melt and start kind of interacting with other molecules more rapidly than a more saturated, longer chain fat.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. And so if we're doing this, sorry, I just saw my wife sneak in the room behind us, coming through the door to get her computer. Hey, babe, can you close that door? It would be fantastic. I'll get it. Oh, okay. So it happens when you both work from home.
Totally get it.
So where do omega-3s and omega-6s come in here? And maybe really quickly, I think it would be useful for people to appreciate, because I think like the saturated, unsaturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated is great. Where does like a fried food come into here? Because that's a very human created fat where we're kind of like artificially making something that would not ever exist itself in nature.
Mm-hmm. Great question. So these polyunsaturated fats, kind of like I mentioned, where when a carbon's fully saturated, it's not talking to anybody. When a carbon is not fully saturated, it wants to interact because it wants to get fully saturated. So in nature, these polyunsaturated fats like an omega-3, they're naturally unsaturated, but they also are going to be sensitive. They can get oxidized. Any polyunsaturated fat can. The interesting thing about omegas is that they're essential fats. So similar to essential amino acids, when we talked about protein, we have to eat them to consume them, so our bodies can't make their own. Omega-3s and omega-6s are both essential. They're super interesting though because they have so the omega-3 refers to, there's a double bond, 3 carbons from the methyl end. Whereas how we often label fats is from the carboxylic acid end. So the omega-3 means there's a double bond at the 3rd carbon. The omega-6 indicates there's a double bond at the 6th carbon. So they behave differently biochemically because of this. And they're it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but in some ways they're competitors because what they both do is they initiate a chemical pathway. They're a little bit of an initiator or an instigator in a sense. And omega-3s overall instigate more of what we consider an anti-inflammatory pathway. Just the different molecules that they're going to trigger and talk to and things of that nature. It gets pretty complicated, but they trigger more of this anti-inflammatory cascade, whereas omega-6 trigger an inflammatory cascade more so. The misunderstanding, though, is that some of that is fine. We totally want that. If you break a bone, you want inflammation. That's going to help you heal. So we know we need those. But it looks like in the wild, we had a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 as perhaps 1-to-1, maybe 2 or 3-to-1, 6-to-3. The modern average American is more like 20-to-1. So the problem there is obvious in terms of, okay, so the inflammatory intakes are monstrous compared to the anti-inflammatory intakes, and that might be where there's some issues there because we're triggering that more inflammatory cascade frequently. But we're also getting these omega-6s, not just from some naturally occurring omega-6 in our protein, but we're eating things like soybean oil that's put in a fryer. The problem with that is it's an omega-6, it's polyunsaturated, and remember, polyunsaturated fats kind of want to talk to other things because they're not satisfied. They're a little bit of a zombie molecule where they kind of like bite you, then you become a zombie, then that bites something, then that becomes a zombie. So these omega-6s can get super oxidized at that heat and they're not happy there. They need to interact. They need to look for somebody to bond with. So then they can come into our body and kind of trigger some zombie biting in there and potentially create some inflammation. And so we have some concerns about that. I think the big thing really is the oxidation and that mega dose that modern Americans are getting. And then we're making these kind of man-made omega-6 fats that are really, really cheap. And then we dump them in a fryer later.
Yeah, not ideal. Not ideal in the least.
Not fabulous.
Not fabulous. No. So let's talk more kind of, I think, practical application here. with regards to, all right, all that background science is fantastic, but what does it actually mean in the real world when it comes time to sit down to eat food, right? To actually put and consume calories. I think that from a quantity standpoint, we're looking at, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I always think of fat as 0.4 to 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. Somewhere in that range is generally where you probably want your fat intake to be on a given day. And I think that a really important point here, and this is just like a rule or a law of, I think, good nutrition, is that your fats and your carbs need to move in opposite directions. Okay, if you think of them each as dimmer switches, if the dimmer switch for fat is getting turned up, the dimmer switch for carbs needs to get turned down. And vice versa. If you're going to jack up the carb dimmer switch, the fat dimmer switch probably has to come down. You don't want both of these up simultaneously, but that's where a lot of people end up just because of the way a modern diet looks. Carbs are really high, fats are really high, and that's obviously going to lead to some issues, right? So they should move in opposite directions. And so when I'm thinking quantity and I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, we want to be 0.4 to 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. Like if you're going to push up towards the 0.7, the higher end of the range, make sure you drop your carbs lower. If you're going to push lower to the 0.4, you can push your carbs higher. The way personally I like to run it is like if I'm going to have a lift day where like I know my carbs will be higher, I tend just to set my fats at 0.4 grams per pound. Put it at the low end, put my carbs higher, especially since I know that I tolerate carbs very well. And then if I'm going to have an off day or just like an easy day where we go like hike and walk around in the mountains, I'll put the fat up more towards like 0.7 and bring my carbs lower. And so I want to just throw that back to you. Do those numbers kind of check out?
100%. And I think that's the creative license is sometimes what gets confusing to people. But nutrition is definitely a science of using the right tool for the job. So if we have athletes that we're trying to put muscle on them, they're doing a lot of glycolytic work, more high intensity, energy output, they need more carbs. So the fat might not be appropriate there, but then they might have an off day where, yeah, they're going for a walk or they're rowing or maybe they're not doing anything and they're just like really resting. They can pull fat up. I think that's also where people get confused. I've seen this happen to quite a few athletes where they hear about eating lower carb, higher fat, and that fuels performance, but they might be an athlete that's like powerlifting. Or doing CrossFit style workouts and things of that nature. And the really high fat diet isn't appropriate because, as we were mentioning a little bit ago, we need oxygen to oxidize those fatty acids. So the carbs are faster fuel in a lot of ways. So the fat just has to be used appropriately, but exactly right. In the American diet, the trouble people get in is that everything is high. The carbs are really high, the fat's really high, calories are super high. And then usually in the standard American setting, we're also not moving adequately. So I think that's sometimes where athletes, like a lot of the wonderful people in the rebel community, these are people who are moving, and they keep hearing that they shouldn't eat carbs, but they're not living a standard American lifestyle. They're moving a lot, and we're trying to put muscle on. So sometimes they're surprised by how much carb they can have, but their bodies are using it, and they need it for that type of workload.
For sure. And then maybe let's look at kind of, if we want to give people a grocery list concept here, idea for fats, like what are like good healthy fats that we should be seeing more often?
Mm-hmm. So in regard, especially too, because we mentioned the omega-3 to omega-6 situation, because some people might be thinking, shoot, how do I get rid of these omega-6s? The big thing would be when we eat less processed food. I know it sounds like an oversimplification in some ways, but when we eat less super processed food frequently, we do get less things like soybean oil. That's going to be in stuff like granola bars and crackers and cereal and a lot of packaged goods. So check labels, and really definitely more so some of those more whole foods are just going to be easier to manage this. So we want to look for really good olive oil and avocado oil for when we're cooking. A little coconut oil is okay too. I love to use flaxseed oil on salads. We get wonderful omega-3s from fatty wild fish. So that way we're kind of also, walnut and sesame oil. So oils like that. We get wonderful fats from also nuts, seeds, and avocado. There's also some really healthy fats in dairy if we tolerate it. So I like to think of diversity and a little bit more of those whole food sources and just use the right fat for the job. If you need to cook something at high heat, use avocado oil. It has a really high smoke point. If you're lightly sauteing a vegetable, use a little olive oil. And then you're getting a nice diversity of fats in there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I usually tell people when they ask, I'm like, okay, olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, maybe grass-fed butter or ghee if you do well with that sort of thing, nuts, seeds, avocado's great. Clearly get in your fishes, and if you don't eat a lot of fish, then maybe we probably want to look at some type of a fish oil omega-3 supplement for you. It's just too important to not be getting in, right? Just make sure you get one that's really freaking high quality, because the fish oil realm gets really sketchy really quickly, like a lot of rancid oil in pills. And so personally, if I'm going to go after a fish oil supplement, I always go with the liquid form, because like you can hide a lot in a pill. You can't hide fish oil if I open it in a bottle and like I'm literally consuming like the straight oil. Like you're going to know really quickly if that's off and wrong. And so, yeah, I think from the grocery list standpoint, pretty straightforward. And I think, again, you're looking to avoid all of the artificial fats that we essentially create in labs, right? The things found in the middle of the grocery store as opposed to the outside of the grocery store, if you will. Mm-hmm. And then, where do animal fats come into this with regards to, getting fat from red meat or like pork, bacon, things in those realms, right? Because like I think people hear different things, different stories around that. Like you have some people maybe more in the keto realm, or like whoever the keto guy is on Instagram that's super popular now. Whatever his name is. I don't remember. I did hear a hilarious
out there.
Oh no, there's one in particular. Oh, Liver King. That's who it is. Yes. Liver King, yes. I heard like a funny story about him. He posted something that he like stayed in an Airbnb, and then the Airbnb host like left him a review as the guest, and was like, so he threw away all of my shampoo, all of my soap, and all of like the like canola oils and everything that he had in the house, and he replaced everything with like lard and ghee and butter and animal products. And I was like, that's actually hilarious.
The thing of butter in the shower.
Yeah, exactly. But I want to touch base on that because I think, again, like that's a place where you hear these extremes. You have some people on one end that are like, oh my God, you can't take in any animal fat because you're just going to get cancer and die. And then you have like the other extreme of people that are like, bro, just eat animal fats all day long and you're going to crush. That's what our ancestors did. And again, the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. So when we think animal fats, like how should people approach that? Like moderation is key usually for most of these things. But I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on that for folks.
For sure. And it's definitely a case of, we also have to have some body context, because we definitely have some people who are going to be prone to their LDL and things like that just running high. Familial hypercholesterolemia is definitely a reality for some folks, and they do nicely on a lower saturated fat diet. So the big thing too, I'll stress with people, track data. Grab your labs. Even if you're young, grab your labs. Always make sure you're seeing your PCP for a yearly checkup. Always take a look at your labs, and then you'll have data over time, because that way you don't want to be 40 and say, I don't know what my LDL was when I was 25 and lifting all the time. You might find you always run a little hot, and that way if it's a little elevated, you're not going to be freaked out, because that's how your body is. Or if you're changing your diet and you're going way higher fat with more animal fats, just make sure you have data pre and post. So I do always recommend that for starters, because body context is going to be unique. We all have different genetics, but that naturally occurring fat from meat is something that in moderation is likely just fine, especially when we have a whole foods diet. So it looks like there's some really nice synergy likely between having animal proteins and then a large dose of phytochemicals and fiber from a really nice vegetable, like as a side dish. Those seem to work really nicely together, and any concern from either of those food groups seem to work a little bit synergistically at meal times potentially. For example, there's some data out about different types of phytochemicals that are in wonderful foods like broccoli and how they might neutralize one or two of the compounds that seem to possibly be a concern in red meat and things like that. So the overall quality of the diet will allow for some wiggle room and moderation there when the diets also rich in omega-3s and fiber and things like that, then some naturally occurring saturated fats from an animal protein likely are not an issue at all. I think where people get into trouble is when they really go nuts with this stuff. So when there's butter in the coffee, coconut oil on, whatever the heck.
Everything.
Yeah, and then like liver, and then a big piece of steak, and there's just nothing else in the day, we're going to see some issues in the blood work, possibly. And if not, maybe their genetics are allowing them that. So I say body context in moderation, and always use data.
Yeah, I think there's always levels to this conversation, right? There's levels of complexity and nuance. And as we peel back the layers of that onion, we learn more and more about you. And I think everybody just wants to hear, okay, like, well, what's the answer? What's the right answer? And the simple fact of the matter is there is no one perfect right answer for every human on Earth, right? Because like your unique genetics and experiences and lifestyle and things going on in your life right now are going to matter. The experience that your mother had when you were in the womb is going to matter and dictate how you manage and deal with food now that you are born and out into the world, right? You just have to go look back at research from like the Dutch hunger winter to appreciate how big of an impact the mother's experience has on the baby to come. And then we can backtrack that even farther and say, okay, awesome. Like, what part of the world are your ancestors from? Right? Because we know for a fact that there are differences. Like if you look at the Inuit populations, what's going on with the mitochondria is substantially different than if you look at a population from, sub-Saharan Africa. The Inuit populations tend to have much higher mitochondrial leak. They do much better with really high fat. And a lot of that has to do because of the fact that they live in unbelievably cold places. And so for a mitochondria to have more leak is beneficial because that's heat, right? Like if you have more electron leak, that's essentially generating more heat. So it's helping them to be more, manage body temperature better in really cold environments. You go to sub-Saharan Africa where it's just hot all the freaking time. You don't want the leak. That's not beneficial. You don't have a problem staying warm. So they have they have less electrons dropping off going towards heat, and they have more actually flowing through going towards ATP. And so it's just as you continue to unpack this more and more, that's where we want to do our best to try to give a general prescription that's going to help 80, 85, 90% of you out there. But there's always going to be deeper levels to take this to tailor it really to you. And I think that's just something that people have to keep in mind. They don't like that. They don't want to hear that, but that's the truth of the matter. But also we can say with 100% confidence that if you stick to the basics like we've been talking about in these kind of episodes, you're probably going to do really well. I think it's just it's the swings to the extremes that get people. And then, when you start bringing autoimmunity, food sensitivities, things like that to the table, that's a conversation that changes the conversation, right? To a pretty large extent. But I have to throw that in there because I think that people need to appreciate that.
Yeah, there's going to be actually quite a bit of genetic variation. So keeping body context in mind is so important. And we do see that around the globe. Different populations having different traditional diets and then a proclivity towards handling those nutrients really, really well. There actually recently, it was just this past year, I want to say it was out of Japan, there was a study that looked at ketogenic diets in Japanese females, and it was not favorable. It didn't look so good in their lab work and how they were feeling. They didn't handle that super high fat, really low carb diet very well. And then you look at their traditional diet and likely what's going on genetically there, it just was not appropriate.
Yeah, they eat a lot of rice. There's a lot of rice in that diet from a very long period of time.
Right, exactly. And I think we just have to start being able to tolerate that in the nutrition and wellness industry. I know people love to get those quick answers, but they really just don't make sense. The human body is a little too cool for that.
Yeah, for sure. So if we wanted to sum up our fat conversation here with kind of a base prescription, again, speaking to what's probably going to be super useful and helpful to 85 to 90% of people out there, what would kind of just our base generic fat prescription right out of the gate be? And then see how it works for you. And then you collect data and we manipulate and make changes once you're off and running.
Mm-hmm. I think definitely first get your protein at an appropriate level for you. Then use up as much carbs as you need for the type of exercise you have, and bump that up if needed. So the more and more anaerobic someone's getting, they need more carbs. and then use fat for the rest, which often shakes out. It can be a pretty wide range, but as we said, 0.4 to 0.7, also sometimes 10 to 35% of total calories is given as a value there. And then make sure that the diet is really rich in omega-3. Sometimes an easy way to think about the omega-3 to omega-6 issue is just to focus on getting more omega-3s, just like really focus on adding those in, and then shopping the perimeter of the grocery store and using those whole food fat sources as much as we can, and be very conservative with fried food dosages. Yes,
it's delicious. Don't get me wrong. I love me some like chicken and waffles, but yes.
Yep. Just occasional with those.
In moderation, team. In moderation. Well, fantastic, Erin. This was really, really good. And I think the one thing I was going to piggyback on that you mentioned there with regards to kind of the make sure you're getting in the carbs based off your output and activity, because that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to match carb versus fats based off of the demand of the activity in front of you. And like if I was going to give people a really easy rule of thumb to follow, I think that if you're kind of more in a weight loss group, I generally try to approach meals as saying like, okay, you get your protein, you get your veggies, you get your fat, and then you just ask yourself the question, have I worked out hard recently? If the answer is yes, then you get carbs at that meal, the rice, the quinoas, the fruit, all of those things. Right. And then if you're more in the weight gain group, you just pretty much always get the carbs, right? Like I think if I was going to try to make it as simple as possible for folks, if you're in the weight loss group, don't go for the carbs unless you can answer yes to the I worked out hard recently question. If you're in the weight gain group, then yeah, you pretty much get carbs at every meal. Just like don't go insane with it. But again, like that's trying to make something incredibly simple for folks, not worrying about like timing and like when you work out and pre and post workout nutrition and all that stuff. But I think as a basic rule of thumb, that's a good place for folks to start.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And I think too, with fats, just keeping an eye on where they can sneak in. For the weight loss crowd also, people are often really surprised at just how high those can get too. So just learning to read labels and just getting a little more comfortable investigating what's a good fit for your body.
For sure. Well, Erin, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I hope everybody has been enjoying these. If you have questions, pop on over to Instagram, drop us a DM and let us know. We would love to help out. And I hope everybody has a beautiful week.
Thank you so much for having me.